Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain where they could be alone. There in their presence he was transfigured. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them. They were talking with him. Then Peter spoke to Jesus. "Lord," he said, "it is wonderful for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He was still speaking when suddenly a bright cloud covered them with shadow. And from the cloud there came a voice which said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. He enjoys my favor. Listen to him." When they heard this, the disciples fell on their faces, overcome with fear. But Jesus came up and touched them. "Stand up," he said. "Do not be afraid." And when they raised their eyes, they saw no one but only Jesus. As they came down from the mountain, Jesus gave them this order: "Tell no one about the vision until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The mystery of the Transfiguration is a very luminous one. So today I just want to unpack it a little bit and then discuss why Jesus in fact allowed the 3 disciples that were closest to him to witness his transfiguration, and then talk a bit about what it can mean for us. So sometimes when we consider this gospel and the transfiguration, some people think that what Jesus showed them was his divinity, Peter, James and John. But I just ask you a simple question. Can these human eyes actually see divinity? Why not? Right answer. Why not? What are they actually made for? To see you and I, to see light, to see everything else, to see material things, not to see divinity. So divinity is purely spiritual. It's immaterial. So these eyes cannot see immaterial things. Do we see angels? No. Do we see God? No. Not until we get to heaven. Then he has to give us a special grace and forms our minds, raises our minds to recognize him. And we will know him intuitively, directly. This is straight St. Thomas Aquinas and the teachings of the Catholic Church. So it's not his divinity that Jesus allowed them to see, but rather his glorified humanity. This is the human glory that flowed over his body and flows over now as he is after his resurrection in heaven. On this earth, when Jesus walked the earth still before his death and resurrection, his glory that he had as the eternal Son of the Father was not overflowing into his body. It was there in his soul, and when the church teaches us that he had what's called the beatific vision, which is what we will have when we see God face to face in heaven. But if this glory were to overflow into his body, do you think Jesus could have been an example for us on this earth? Exactly, he could not have been. Because if his body was filled with glory, then it's already glorified. When a body is glorified, can it die? No. Do you think we'd be spending all our time working and striving to get to heaven so we can have a glorified body that's going to die again? No. So I want more conviction. So exactly, our glorified bodies will never ever die because they're sustained by the power of an indestructible life. And so if Jesus had his glorified body already on this earth, then he could not only not die, so he couldn't have the crucifixion, he couldn't be sick, he couldn't suffer, he couldn't experience rejection, he couldn't experience a whole lot of things. So in terms of his ability to be an example for us, it would have been a very poor one. This what shows God's grandeur by emptying himself of his glory, even though the glory was there in his soul, because he had the beatific vision. Nevertheless, he emptied himself of glory so that he could experience all the limitations that we experience on this earth, except, of course, the limitation of sin, which is a subhuman reality. Jesus lived the fullness of human life. We, when we sin, in whatever way that we sin, we in fact become subhuman. We lessen ourselves to what we really are called to be. So Jesus allowed Peter, James and John to see his glorified humanity. And the way the Gospels explain it is that his clothes became as bright as light, whiter than any whitener could make them, as bright as the sun and so forth. When Jesus one time showed the first woman doctor of the church, St. Teresa of Avila, she lived in the 1500s, and he showed her his glorified hand, and she said it was brighter like 100,000 suns. It was just so bright. And he told her that very rarely, when he appears to people, does he actually appear in his physical body. It's always an impression of him. He says the only times he appears, very rarely, or when he comes in the Eucharist. Then it's truly his body, his blood, his soul, and his divinity. So Jesus allows them to see his glorified humanity that we will look upon in heaven, please God, when we get there. The other evangelists, so Matthew tells us that Moses and Elijah came. The other evangelists tell us that they also, what they talked about. So Matthew just says they were talking with him. But aren't you interested to know what he was talking about with them? Absolutely. I mean, I am curious. And the other, St. Luke tells us that they were talking about his passing. In other words, what he was going to accomplish in Jerusalem, his death and his resurrection. So you might wonder, why was it Moses and Elijah? Why not Hezekiah or Isaiah? Why not Jeremiah or Ezekiel that were there? Well, because the two prophets that appeared were symbolic of particular things in the Old Testament. Moses was the representative of the law. He is the one through whom God gave the ancient Israelites the law, his teaching. And remember, Moses had to go up to the mountain twice, not once, to get the 10 Commandments, because upon his return after 40 days, he finds the people having made a golden calf, and they're dancing and so forth, and worshipping a false god. And so Moses destroys the stone tablets. He pulverizes the golden calf, and in fact, he then forces the people to drink it. In much the same way as when a dog, poos in the wherever it shouldn't in the house, you grab its face and rub it in it to remind it that this is not what you do, particularly if it's being stubborn, or any animal for that matter. But that's what Moses did. And so then went up the mountain again, 40 days, 40 nights, not eating or drinking, and he receives the stone tablets again from God. So, they're the first 5 books, and of course Moses himself didn't write them down, someone else wrote them down, but they contain his teachings. Elijah, on the other hand, is the representative of the prophets. Now, wasn't Moses a prophet? Of course he was. He's the greatest of the prophets of the Old Testament, but he's remembered as the prophet, the giver of the law. And St. Matthew, in his Gospel, has a theme that Jesus is the new Moses, because on the Sermon on the Mount, from chapters 5 to 7, he has Jesus going up a mountain, he sits down, and he starts to teach the people. He is the new Moses. Elijah, on the other hand, is the prophet who was there in Israel at the lowest point in the history of Israel. You might think there's chaos in the church at times. You might think there are priests and bishops who are confusing, who are not teaching Catholic faith, and certainly there are, unfortunately, too many at times. But even one who doesn't do it is, in fact, one too many. As a retired bishop in this country said to me once, that Mark, just as the apostles have always had their successors, so has Judas. And that's just a sad reality. But don't think we're ever as bad as what it got to in ancient Israel. There was a time under King Ahab, and Ahab is the ahav, the Hebrew word for to snatch, or to take, to seize. And King Ahab was an absolutely corrupt king. But not only was he corrupt, but also were the religious leaders in the various towns in ancient Israel. Most of the people's hearts had gone away from the Lord their God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the only true prophet was Elijah, whose name means, will you break up the name? Eli. Eli means in Hebrew, my God. And J-A-H is the first half of the name Yahweh, which is that sacred name given to God, given to Moses by God. And it's the sacred name, so sacred that it could not be pronounced. So effectively, Elijah's name in Hebrew means, my God is Yahweh. So in his very name, in his very person, he represents his own personal faith. Meanwhile, the number of false prophets of Baal in Hebrew means several different words, husband, owner, master, Lord, or the name of a false god. There were 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. So 850 false prophets and only one true prophet. And Elijah tells King Ahab, says, you assemble all of Israel together on Mount Carmel, and there we will discuss, we will talk. By the way, when Elijah says we will talk, that means roll up your sleeves, bring your baseball bat, and we will talk, right? Outside, that kind of talking. So, of course, he asked for 2 bulls to be given, and God says or Elijah says, okay, the God that responds with fire, he is God. The people say, yes, agree, deal. So he tells the other 850 to prepare the bull. And they prepare the bull, dig a trench around it, and so forth, but not set fire to it. And so they're going all day, and they're gashing themselves, and cutting themselves, and chanting. And of course, Baal is a stupid statue. There's no life in it, there's no divinity, and so nothing happens. Meanwhile, it comes to the evening time, the time of the sacrifice. Elijah tells the people, come around me. He prepares the bull, covers it with water, the trench, and so forth, and then he calls God to respond with fire. And God descends fire on the earth and the bull and consumes it totally. And so the people chant, the Lord is God. The Lord is God. And then Elijah takes care, with the baseball bat effectively, but he kills all the other 850 false prophets, which was in keeping with the law of Moses. So anyone who was a threat to the faith of the people was a threat to the entire people. That's why Elijah appears beside Jesus on Mount Tabor. In fact, the role of all of the prophets was to call the people back to faithfulness to the covenant. Prophecy in the Old Testament wasn't about predicting the future. We often have that sort of notion, but it's actually mistaken. The role of the prophet was to call people back to faithfulness to the covenant. So Moses and Elijah are talking with Jesus about his passing in Jerusalem and what he would accomplish. Now, what was the purpose of Jesus revealing this? And of course, the voice, known as a theophany, which means a revelation of God. Theos from the Greek, phaneia, to manifest, to make known, or to manifest more accurately. So theophania. And God is saying, this is my son in a very unique way. Listen to him, or hear him, as the Greek says, hear him. So, Jesus allows them to see his glorified humanity, so that when they see the shock of the crucifixion, they would not lose faith. they would look upon him crucified and bruised and beaten. By the way, our crucifix is very, very neat and tidy compared to what Jesus' broken body on the cross looked like. If you want a closer understanding of what he would have looked like, look at the Mel Gibson's film, I think back in 2004, The Passion of the Christ, and that's a much closer resemblance of what would have happened to our Lord after the scourging and the crowning with thorns and the eventual crucifixion. So, to look upon the crucifixion of our Lord, they were still going to have that vision. He's divine. His glory is hidden underneath, so not to lose trust in him. Notice, by the way, that Mother Mary is not on Tabor. And notice that Jesus never appears to her after his resurrection. Do we ever see anywhere in the Gospels where he appears to his mother? No. Why doesn't he appear to his mother? Absolutely, he would have appeared to his mother, I have no doubt, and she would have been the first one to see him. Why wouldn't he appear to his mother in the Gospels? Yes?
Because he knew his mother believed in him, and she didn't need that proof.
She didn't need the proof, exactly. So he appeared to her to reassure her and so forth, but her faith didn't fail. And the Gospels are always telling us what the reassurance of the faith of the disciples and the apostles who had lost their faith. So even though Jesus prepared them for what was coming, they still lost it. They still lost their faith. They were weak men. They lost their faith. And only Our Lady did not lose faith. That's why in the Gospel there's no reassurance of her faith, but she didn't need it. She always believed. She never stopped believing. So that was the first reason why Jesus let them see his glorified humanity. The second reason, though, was to reveal that, and that's why he says to them, don't say anything about this until after the Son of Man is risen from the dead. Amongst themselves, they had no idea. And we might think amongst ourselves, can't you figure out rising from the dead? But that's not very fair, because we've been used to reflecting upon the resurrection with the church for 2,000 years. Not that any of us is 2,000 years old, but we have the benefit and the privilege of all that reflection and sureness of teaching. The apostles, remember, did not have this. They didn't have it. So, rising from the dead, the closest they would have gotten would have been like a resuscitation. Elijah had raised a few people from the dead. Jesus was going to raise Lazarus. He raised the son of the widow of Nain. He raised a little girl. But it wasn't resurrection. They had no idea what that meant. So before we judge the apostles too harshly for their being obtuse and thick and whatever, just hold your horses a bit, because they didn't have the vantage point that we do. So it was to reveal, the second reason for the Transfiguration was to reveal the glorified life that awaits every one of the children of God who will be saved. Now, in our society, whenever there is any mention of heaven or in the next life, it's kind of spoken of automatically that everybody gets there. Is that true? No. Absolutely not. Heaven is not an automatic thing. Heaven must be worked for. We must strive to get to heaven. God gives us heaven freely, just as He gives us His grace. But we cannot rest on our laurels and think that somehow we're going to get to heaven regardless of the kind of life that we live. And amongst all the many good actions we must live, the first action is that we must keep that first commandment. Jesus says, "He who loves me will keep my commandment, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him." What's the first commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. When you look at the 10 principles on the path of divine renovation, is giving priority to the weekend. What this means is that our Sunday Mass is the focus of what we do on the weekend. It is the epitome, the absolute pinnacle of what we must do. And this is how we put God first. But we see that this is not always the case. And the church teaches and has taught from the beginning that Sunday Mass is an obligation, but in fact an obligation, I hate talking about obligations, because when someone does something out of obligation, they're not doing it out of love. That this is something that we must do out of love, desiring to worship God, to gather together with the Christian community and to receive the Eucharist, to be fed by the Word and to be nourished with one another in our faith so that we can go and live the faith throughout the week. But how often so many make excuses about why they cannot go to Mass. And I'm going to give 2 reasons that really excuse. Other reasons I find it harder to justify. Firstly, if we're truly sick, and I don't mean have a little sniffle, I mean that we're sick enough to be in bed. If we're sick enough and we can still go for a meal with someone in a cafe, go to the movies, or do something else, are we really sick enough? No, we're not. It's just an excuse. And the other reason that we might be travelling and it's just impossible for us to get to Mass. But in those cases, still that 3rd commandment of the 10 commandments, keep holy the Sabbath day, requires us that we sanctify the day, that we spend time in prayer, whether we read scripture for half an hour and pray the rosary, do an hour of prayer, as well as we can, of course. When you're sick, really sick, is it easy to concentrate? No. You're delirious, you might have a temperature or whatever. You sanctify the day as best you can. But sanctifying the day is necessary. On the other hand, if I am tired on a Sunday morning, does that excuse me from going to Mass? No. If I'm on holidays, does that excuse me from going to Mass? No. And yet how many, when we're travelling on holidays and so forth, is it our priority that we work out where the nearest Catholic church is so we can get to Mass? I mean, don't put your hands up, but is that our thinking? Or, oh, it doesn't really matter, I'm on holidays now. That reflects a poor attitude in our hearts, and that God isn't really the centre. Our faith isn't the centre of our hearts. And if it isn't the centre of our hearts, then the promise of the Transfiguration made to the apostles, and indeed later to be revealed to all the early Christians and to all of us, isn't automatic. So I pray that everybody wishes urgently to go to heaven, but to bear in our minds that our worship of God on a Sunday is the pinnacle, the hallmark of the placing God as first in our lives. And to realize that if we don't come to Mass on a Sunday through our own fault, then it is a grave sin. And we can't receive Holy Communion until we've gone to confession. Again, this is a teaching that has been forgotten by many Catholics. And I just want to put it out there because we all need refreshers to hear things again and again. And if we're not able to receive communion, then to receive, because we're not in the state of grace or we haven't fasted for food and drink, whatever the reason, then to receive a blessing instead. And there's no judgment from me, certainly, but of course the judgment ultimately comes from God, who knows our innermost secret thoughts. So the Feast of the Transfiguration is one that should give us lots of hope. Not only how God cares for his disciples to prepare them, even though the preparation failed to achieve the desired result, but how he also reveals for us our own future destiny, but a destiny that can only come about when we freely take it on board through a life of virtue, but particularly placing God as the center of our lives in all